Hello, this is Lady B, and this week I wanted to share with you some tips and tricks for painting a filament printed 3D model. Now, home printing 3D models is becoming increasingly popular, and there's two basic types of printers that you can buy. There's the filament printers and there's the resin printers. Now, the difference of that is the filament printer works by laying down line after line after line and building up whatever your model is, where the resin printer dips into a resin basin and then slowly pulls up and builds on the resin in a solid piece. It is not layered. And I have here an example. This is a resin print, and you can see how it's smooth here. And also you have all these little details. This is actually one of my son's models that he has printed on his resin printer. It's from World of Warcraft and the Heresy line, Horus Heresy line. And it has all these beautiful little details, and you've got this smoothness, and they're just beautiful. But if you're looking to buy a printer for home use, a lot of people don't buy the resin. They go to the filament instead. And the reason is because these resin printers do require venting. There's gases that come with the resin, and some of them can be quite toxic. There's more involved. You have to cure it. You have to rinse it. A lot more materials involved. And the big one, though, really is the venting. A lot of people who buy these resin printers do have special rooms they put it in with special ventilation to it, just to keep the rest of their house healthy. Also, the printers for making these are 3 times the cost of a filament printer. So if you're just looking to make something fun for you, for your family, a filament printer often is the way to go, especially if you don't have a special place you can put your resin printer. So then the question comes about painting them. This is an example of a filament print. And I've got this paper here so you can see it a little better. You can see how on the back here, there's lines. And that shows you the layering of the print with the filament that you don't have with the resin. And that's the one disadvantage of these filament prints, is you do have these lines. Now, you can print these at much higher, I don't know if you call it higher res or whatever. You can control how dense those lines are, how small they are, how close together they are. And you can do a higher quality print, which gets you much, much better details, less of this ribbing. But even then, with the higher quality prints, it does create these layers, creates complications, and it results in having to use a few different techniques than you normally would when painting figures like this. Now, this particular model is Astra from the Wearing the Cape superhero book series. And I have, a couple years ago, I actually painted a larger one of these, a higher quality print too, so that it was closer together. Like I said, with the filament, you can control that. It does determine how long it takes to print. The thinner your layers, the longer it's going to take to print your model. And that particular one was a gift I was doing for the author of the series. And I can have a picture of it. I can post right here so you can see this other model I have already painted in the past. Now, like I said, this is a lower quality, so it's going to show more as I use these tricks. But it was while I was painting this first one I discovered that there were things you had to do differently than standard model painting. Because I've done model painting for years, and this did turn out to be different. So, the first thing you have to undo with these filament painted models is you have to sand them. Now, this particular one was printed from a wood. It had wood in it. So it's sanded very nicely. The thing about sanding these is, especially if you have used a purely plastic extrusion filament, is you want to wear a mask to protect yourself from all the little particles, and you don't want to sand it anywhere near where you're going to be painting or where you are going to be eating. Because, and again, with this having wood filaments, it wasn't so bad. But for the purely plastic ones I've sanded, those little plastic particles that you sand off can hang in the air for days. And if you sand it where you're going to paint it, those little particles will get attached to your paint, and you'll end up with all these little bumps in your paint. You're not going to get a smooth finish. Also, you don't really want it in your food. So don't use it, and you do it in your dining room, and don't do it where you're going to paint. You prepare the surface by sanding it as smooth as you can without destroying any details. Now, for sanding, I used a combination of sandpaper and these. These are actually files intended for jewelry making. You can also buy, if you go to craft stores, you can buy special files intended to be used on figures, on 3D printed models. And those are very, very helpful for getting into small areas. But I used a fine and an extra fine sandpaper. This was I believe my extra fine. It's a 220 grade. And I just ripped off little pieces and used it to get into the spots where I could. And I used this is the fine, and it is a 120 that I used. Again, just ripped it off. Did this one first, then I did this one. And just smoothing it out, some of those ridges. And then once you have sanded it and you smoothed it out, the next step is to clean it. And it's important that you clean it because, like I said, there's all those little particles left from sanding, and you don't want those on your figure. Now, there's a couple ways to do it, and I've done it a couple ways. One way, because if you're using a plastic, is to just wash it off. And I've done that, where you just wash it in cold water, and then you just make sure you get it dry, and the surface is clean. There's no particles left on it. Another way to do it is to use a tack cloth. That's what this is. You can pick these up for cheap at home repair stores. They're used in furniture refinishing, and they are a cheesecloth that has had like a varnish-like substance added to it that makes it sticky. And this will pick up any dust of any kind on your figure. It might leave the surface slightly tacky, but that's okay because that will just make it easier for your paint to stick to it. But it will take that off. And this is actually what I used this time because my particles were so fine. And because I had a wood type filament, I didn't want to get it wet, so I stuck with the tack cloth. So once you have that figure sanded and cleaned, now it's time to paint it. Or more accurately, now it's time to prime it. And this is another thing you have to do differently. Now, normally when I am painting 3D figures, especially these figures, these resin printed figures, and I actually started years ago with pewter. I still miss the pewter. They're wonderful. But these days it's resin because pewter just costs too much. I use a spray primer. And you can buy really good quality spray primers for figures that you've printed at craft stores, usually meant for things like Warhammer. However, you cannot use a spray primer on a filament print. The primer will only lay down on the top of the ridges. Even after you've sanded it, it is not going to be 100% smooth. And if you use a spray primer and you spray that, it will lay down just on the top of the ridge, and you will end up putting back all those ridges that you just sanded off. The first time I found that out, it was so frustrating because I had just spent 2 hours sanding my figure and making it perfect. And then I primed it, and it was even worse than before I had started. And it took me 3 hours to get it back to where it had been before I primed it. So when you prime, always use a paint brushed on primer. This is the one I used. It's Citadel Color Base. You make sure it says base when you buy it. Now, let's talk for a minute about paints. When it comes to painting these 3D figures, you can, if you want to, use craft paint. It will work, but you'll have to do a lot of layers to get a good result. Instead, I recommend using these types of paints that were intended by miniature enthusiasts to use to paint things like this. And there are several different brands for this. I actually used 3 different brands in painting this. I used Citadel Color. I used, this is War Color is what it says, War Color. And I used my Vallejo paints, which look very similar to this, but is a different company. And all of these and more, there are more brands out there. They're not cheap. You will pay more for these, but they are very highly pigmented, and you will get a much better result. For time saving, quite honestly, I'm not sure how much money you save using craft paints because of how many layers you have to use. So I just recommend go with miniature paints. Now, once you have finished painting on that primer and the primer has dried completely, it's time for the color blocking, which is basically painting a flat paint over the larger areas that those paint colors go with. And then with standard miniature painting, you come back in and you paint your highlights and your shadows using techniques like washes, inks, and dry brushing. You cannot use those techniques with a filament printed model, however. If you try to use an ink, a wash, or a dry brush, all it does is lay down colors in those grooves that have been left from the printing process. So instead, you have to manually paint in your shadows and your highlights. So if you have a figure like this one, where maybe it's a little hard to get in to areas where standardly you do a mid-tone paint, I recommend actually starting with your shadow paint as your base, your color block paint color, so that you can then come in and paint your mid-tones and then your highlights, and you won't have to try and get into these little corners and crevices when you're trying to get a shadow, because it's hard enough to get into these little spaces once, let alone go in there with your shadows and not mess up your other paint colors. So that is another little trick I have found with these. Now, I've only done a mid-tone and shadow on this figure on the hair. I just wanted to show how it's done. Now, something I forgot to mention, sometimes when you're sanding, depending on the figure, filament prints can sometimes be a little fragile and sometimes they'll break. Don't panic. If it breaks while you're sanding, just use a super glue, preferably a gel, but doesn't have to be, but use a super glue to glue it back together. Just finish sanding everything first, and then once you're finished sanding and you've cleaned everything, use the glue to put those pieces back together. Now, brief comment. I don't actually have a video of this, but there is a base that comes with these, like this one. And this is for your figure to stand on. And usually you will paint these also. Now, it's not, and the process is exactly the same as painting the figure, but it is not uncommon to want texture on your base. And there's a few ways you can do that. You can use cork that you break up and glue on to make it look like rubble or dirt. You can add sand, paint to sand, to give it a ground-like texture. What I used was, I used this. Now this is expensive. It's an option. You don't have to do it. There's a lot of cheaper ways. You can even go outside and find little teeny rocks and paint them if you want. But this is a technical paint is what it's called. And it's made to look like snow. In this case, I made it to look like a cloud. But you just add it to your base, and there you have it. You have a really nice base on it. So, those are my tips. Here's my final result of the figure I painted. And just so you can compare, I'll also post the picture of the one I had done before here, so you can see the difference between the higher quality print and the lower quality print. Though in the original I didn't do the hair shading. And here's you can see here's my little texture on the base. And I've just glued this on using a gel super glue. That's all you need to attach things. Now, you would never be able to tell looking at this figure that both her head came off and I lost one of the fingers while sanding. Those glued right back on, and you cannot even tell the difference. I had to do a little extra sanding right after I glued, once the glue dried completely, after I had glued it back on, but you cannot tell. That's a little sanding, a little cleaning, and it's done. So there is the completed figure. Here's the picture of my earlier figure. And that is my tips and tricks for painting 3D filament printed models. Now, I love you all, whether new or old. If this was helpful and you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next week. Until then, just remember, whether painting filament or non-filament models, just remember, don't be afraid to suit yourself and make whatever it is you do exclusively you. And the author, how do I put this? Okay. I'm not sure how to put this. And then once you have sanded it and you smoothed it out, the next step is to prime it. No, the next step is to clean it.